All right. This will be the last lecture in this class. I'm going to cover JavaScript this week, finish up with it. And I'm going to go over some examples. And the examples that I didn't go over, you can go over on your own time and ask me if there are, ask me if you have any questions. As I mentioned before, this is a blended class, so it's expected that you work outside the classroom as well and do some material online as well in addition to the lecture. So today's the last lecture. Next week, I will be in lab, my normal time, but I'll also be in lab during the class time. All right. And that time will be dedicated to this course. So I won't have students from other courses coming in from 9 to 10 Monday. And what my goal is one of two things. If you're having problems with finishing up any of the assignments, that's an extra hour that you can come in and contact me and get assistance in finishing up some of the assignments that you have. But just as important, even if you're doing well on the rest of the assignments, it's a chance to preview your project with me. So it's a chance to get some feedback where there's still time to make the changes. You'll still have a week and a half to make any changes that I suggest. So I offer this, and it's surprising how few students take advantage of this offer. Therefore, I'm urging you to take advantage of it and to either come in person in the lab, BU 102 at 9 a.m., or connect via WebEx, as is mentioned in the syllabus. And you can show me what you have on your project. Even if you don't have a lot done, show me what you have, and we can talk about what you need to do. That way, I hesitate to use these words, but you've really increased your chances of getting a real good grade if you do that. Because I can point out any glaring mistakes that you had, not mistakes, but glaring changes that I would want have made to make the project really, really good. So I encourage you all to do that. All right. So, don't think of it as a free week. Think of it as a week for you to work on your projects and to get feedback on your projects. If you can't make it during that time, you can always contact me, and you can either come to office hours, my regular office hours, or you can make an appointment with me by messaging me and giving me some times that you're available. And I usually can find a time that matches up with your schedule, and I can see you during that time. All right. I'll post an announcement that covers this for those of you that weren't paying attention over that last few lines. And I'm not talking to the people here. I know, of course, they're paying attention, but I'm talking, well, if you thought this is a boring part and fast forwarded over this part, this will give you a chance to read the announcement. Anyhow, here's some JavaScript examples, some more JavaScript examples. I want to show you the one that we had last time and sort of hit the highlights with it. We have two buttons here. One that shows a spoiler, the other changes the color of the question. And we have another button that shows the spoiler there. Remember the sort of triangle that we talked about last time, of there being HTML, which has the content of the page, CSS, which describes how the page is going to look and how it's going to be formatted. And then finally, we have JavaScript that adds interactivity to the page. Interactivity being defined as you do something to the page does something back to you. So in this case, we have our spoiler question. We have our answer to it that is given a style of no display. Therefore, when the page initially loads, you don't see the answer under here. We then have buttons that create an event. That's sort of the first thing that gets the ball rolling in JavaScript, is an event. Something happens. Now that event can be clicking on something, it can be pressing a key down, it can be changing the value of a drop down. It can even be that the page finishes loading. That's an event. All right, but these events happen, and you can write JavaScript code to do something once that activity has started. And in this case, that the event is an on-click event on these various buttons. And then we use the JavaScript statements to change things in the HTML and CSS on the page. And the way that we change things in the HTML and CSS on the page is through what's called the document object model. So we're going to start studying the document object model, and there's ways to reference anything on the page that you want to reference. All right. We're taking a very simple case here, and we're using the ID number. So these paragraphs, spoiler 1, spoiler 2, have an ID of spoiler 1 and spoiler 2. When we click on this button, document means it's somewhere on the page. So the thing that we're interested in changing is somewhere on the page. What thing are we looking on the page? We're looking for the thing that has an ID of spoiler 1. That's this paragraph right here. What about that are we interested in? We're interested in the style of it. And what about the style are we interested in? We're interested in the display attribute, which we've initially set as being none, which means that it is not visible. And we are going to change that to block. And that's going to make the display type of that paragraph block. So it's going to treat the paragraph like a paragraph and have a block display. So that causes the little spoiler to appear. This does the same thing, except we change the background color to yellow. And finally, this code does it, except it changes for spoiler 2. All right. That's kind of what we went over last time in a nutshell. One last thing before we move on to new examples is if something doesn't go right, like for example, if I accidentally typed in spoiler 11 here instead of spoiler 1. And you click on that and nothing happens. All right. How do you try to debug that? Well, you click on these 3 arrows or 3 dots if you're using Chrome. Go under Tools, select Developer Tools, and this is similar if you're using another browser. And then you click on Console, and it will tell you where the error is. And it tells you in a way that might be a little hard to understand, but once you get used to it, you'll sort of figure out how this works. This is saying you cannot read property of null. So what they're saying is there's no such thing as style for this. So it's pointing to you where the line of code is. And if you read between the lines, what it is, hey, this doesn't exist. Get element by ID, spoiler 11. Only spoiler 1 and 2 exist on the page. Therefore, since it can't find it, it can change the style of it. So if you read between the lines, that's telling you that this doesn't exist. So you'd correct it. The other thing to keep in mind is that JavaScript is case sensitive. So if I type this in, similarly, I'm going to get an error, and it's going to tell me get element by ID is not a function. And you might think, well, we studied get element by ID. Why is it not a function? Well, again, we studied it, but it wasn't spelled with a capital D. It was spelled with a lowercase d. All right. That's a JavaScript portion of last week's lecture in a nutshell. Now let's go on to a different example. And we're going to go over this example. I like this example because it has some nice pictures in it, pictures that I actually took. Let's go to Zoo 1. And we have a picture of a lion laying there. Move our mouse over this lion. Move our mouse over that. Okay, I think. So if we put our mouse over the thumbnail, it changes the main image on the page. All right. Now, again, that has to happen through JavaScript. There's no HTML that says to do that. So what we have is we have our basic page that displays. It displays these thumbnails. And then the user event is that the user puts their mouse on one of the thumbnails. And the action is to change the main image to match the thumbnail. So let's look at this example. Let's look at the code for this. All right. We have some very rudimentary CSS here. Section here is my thumbnail section. I give it an ID of 25, ID of thumbnail, and I set the width of that section to 25%. So this takes up, this whole area takes up 25% of the page. I have made the images in that section a width of 100%, but a maximum width of 130 pixels. All right. Why do I have the maximum width on here? Well, because 25% of the page could be really big on a big page, on a wide screen. So I could be over 1,000, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 pixels wide. So 25% of that would be what, 500 pixels, something like that. So I have that maximum width here so that if the page gets too big, and it might be really hard to see the monitor on the screen. I can't quite see it yet, but it's getting there. That these actually become pixelated and become a little bit fuzzy. The reason for that is that these thumbnails smaller versions of the big picture, but I just took it in edit, text edit, and made it smaller. And their width is width of 200 pixels wide. So if it gets over 200 pixels, it's going to be distorted. I don't know why I picked 130 pixels, but that works as well. Remember, this width says 100%. That doesn't mean 100% of the screen. It means 100% of the thumbnails area, because the thumbnails area contains that image. We can make it more obvious to see if we do this. We make the background color of it yellow or something. This is something I suggest doing if you're debugging CSS. Add color or borders or other things to your elements so that you can see where they start and end. Here I can't really see, well, here I can't really see where the thumbnails section ends. Does it end over here? Does it end over here? But if I give a background color of yellow, then I can see that. And you see, there it goes. And it's 100%, but it's also a maximum of 130. So it limits the width to 130. All right. UL, I get rid of the dots because it really wouldn't look good to have dots next to those thumbnail images because they're in a list. This thumbnail section is a list of thumbnails. And therefore it wouldn't look good if there was dots next to it. So this line of code says, hey, get rid of the dots. I then have my big picture section. Big picture section, I have an ID of big picture. I have an ID of the image is big. I set the source to 1 JPEG. Then I give a width of 60%. I float it to the left. I give a margin of 15 pixels. And I make the images have a width of 100%, but a maximum width of 500 pixels. All this is stuff that we should have known before we started talking about JavaScript. Here's where the JavaScript comes in. And this is a case where we're actually going to change the HTML of the page. So on mouse over, that's a different event, right? Before we had on click, so that when you clicked on it, it set the ball in motion. Here, if we put our mouse over that image, it sets the ball in motion. What other events do we have? Well, we can Google them. And we can see a list of events. Some real common ones: on change, on click, on mouse over, on mouse out. So if I pull my mouse off of an element, I can do something. Key down, on load. And then there's a list of, or somewhere I thought there was a list of all of them. There's some more of them. Talking about doing some more of the elements. All right. So it's a list of events that you can do. And what are we going to do? Well, again, we're going to use the document object model to find the thing on the page that we want to change. So we start off with document. That means it's on this page. It's not in some window that we popped up. You might wonder, like, why do we have to say it's on the page? Well, because this code could actually use JavaScript to open up another window, open up another browser window. And we're just telling it, we're not talking about any of the other windows that could be open. We're talking about this page. On this page, find the element, find the thing that has an ID of big. And that is this image tag right here. What about it are we going to change? Well, we can change any of the attributes of this. Well, the attribute, one of the attributes is ID, one is attribute is source, one attribute is the alt attribute. But we're interested in changing the SRC attribute. What do we change it to? We change it to 1 JPEG. So in my folder, I have, for every image, I have 2 versions of it: a smaller thumbnail version and a larger full version or big version of it. And this is saying if my mouse is on this one, set the big image to 1.jpg, and I do the same thing for the other 2 images. Formula is the same: event, document object model, and then we have some JavaScript syntax. Notice the use of single quotes. I mentioned this last time, but it bears repeating. Big and 2 JPEG are in quotes because we're not talking about a variable or something like that. We're talking about those precise exact values. So we want the letters BIG to be the ID. Or we want the source changed to 2.jpg, not the value of some variable or something. Therefore, we put them in quotes. Why do we use single quotes? We use single quotes because the double quotes go around the whole statement. And therefore, we have to use the different quotes inside the statement. We have to use the other kind of quote, the single quote, to designate where we want quotes. So this is a nice little gallery that you can have. Now, one thing that I emphasize with students is the need to have a complete web page. So if I were turning this in as an assignment, I don't know if this by itself would be enough. I would make it look complete. Like, you know, here are some pictures that I took at the zoo, you know, the Cleveland Zoo. And then I might have a blurb about the Cleveland Zoo. I might even have a map to the Cleveland Zoo. All right. And then I would have these images. So my examples, I make bare bones so I can really isolate and show you certain things. That doesn't mean that what you turn in can be that simple and bare bones. A lot of people did that. I'm not even sure if it was this class, but yeah, it might have been another class, but just avoid the temptation to just do something very bare bones. Make it look like a finished web page. You've all seen web pages, all right? So imagine that you came across this on the web. This by itself, if I ran across this on itself, it would be like, well, those are nice animals, but I don't know anything about them. Right? I know this is a lion, right? Because it's obvious. I might not even know what that is. I had to think a second about that. All right. So put some labels on them or whatever. How could we change a label on here? How could we put a label that said what animal it was? Well, let's think about this. I'm going to put a label. I'm going to put my label right here, right underneath the image. All right. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to put underneath the big image a paragraph. And I'm going to give it an ID of description. And I'm going to put in there the code of what happens when the page first loads. So when the page first loads, I see this. I see a lion. So I'm going to put in there, when the page first loads, show image 1 and picture of lion at Cleveland Zoo. All right. Now, when I put my mouse over it, coincidentally, this is also a lion, but I would want to put the code in there to change it to lion. Likewise, if I put my mouse over this one, I would want to put that in there. So what I'm going to do is, on mouse over, I'm going to find the thing on the page that has an ID of description. Don't want big, I want description. And what do I want to change about it? I want to change the HTML between the start and end tag. And the property for that is inner HTML. And for good measure, I want my page to be accessible, right? So I'm going to change the alt attribute of big as well. And that's going to find, again, the thing that on the screen that has the name of big. And I'm going to change the alt attribute to make this accessible. Now, I'm going to end up copying this to the other two images. But you know what? I'm going to test it first. Why am I going to test it? I'm going to test it because if it's wrong, if I'm a mistake in it, I don't want to clone it 3 times and have 3 mistakes. All right. I want to get this right with the one thing, and then I'm going to go in and change it for everything. So, picture of lion. Well, it's kind of hard to test it because it stays a picture of lion. I haven't changed the other one, so I'm going to look to see, at the very least, do I have an error in the console? No, I don't. So that doesn't ensure that it's correct, but at least I know there's no syntax there. So now I feel pretty comfortable to copy this code for the other ones. Be sure to remember to change. Oh, no, we don't have to change. We have to change the values. Pictures of lion at Cleveland Zoo. Picture of lion at Cleveland Zoo. Is there a G on the end or no? Orangutan? Okay. Orangutan. Well, we'll put in a G. Now I reload the page and I can see something funny here. I got a little tag. I must have got my quotes wrong. Let's go back and look. Oh, I have this twice. It works. How can we test if the alt attribute worked? That's a tricky question. We could have a screen reader. We could also break the image. Instead of 1, I'm going to say 1x. What's that going to do? It's not going to be able to find that image, and therefore it's going to display the alt attribute. Picture of lion. If it can't find an image, it displays the alt attribute. So it looks like the alt attribute is working as well. Let's do it down here too. That's a better test. And it changed the alt attribute too. All right. So this is another thing that you can do fairly simply to add some functionality to your page. All right. Think, can you use this anywhere on your project? All right. Is there any place where you have a bunch of photos? Instead of displaying 15 photos on a page to make a real long page, you could have 15 thumbnails that take up relatively little space and have a big image. And as you put your mouse on the thumbnail, you just change the big image. All right, now I have a second version of this, Zoo 2. Difference is simply Well, one difference is click based on mouse over. It doesn't change it as soon as the mouse is over. It changes it when you click on it. So that's one thing that you can do. Let's look at the code here. Actually, two changes here. Oops. Yeah, I never like really consistently worked with two screens at the same time. People love it, but I just never have. I mean, you know, I remember back when I worked as a consultant, especially the graphic designers, they would have these monstrous movie screens on their desk, and they would have two of them. Or maybe one was a slightly smaller movie screen, and they would always move stuff over to the other one and move back and forth. I don't know. Maybe I'm too old school. It's like one screen at a time. I can focus on that. All right. This does something a little bit different. Instead of making the change here, like we did in the previous example, this calls function. Now, what is a function? A function is a group of statements that we give a name to. Why might we want to do that? Well, if we look in this example, these instructions are just about the same in all three times. Now, a rule of programming, I'm not sure if I mentioned it in this class or not, but a rule of programming can be summarized by the acronym DRY. Do not repeat yourself. All right. It's not DNRY because that doesn't form a word. All right. But DRY, do not repeat yourself. So this is really close to duplicated code. I mean, it's the same except for this and this. So what we can do is we can make a function. And the function we give a name to, we have in a script tag, first of all. Script tag says we're in JavaScript land now. Just like a style tag says we're in CSS land. So we have a script tag, we define a function, and we give a spot for two arguments. These arguments are going to be filled in when we call the function. These are variables. So when I call it and I give one.jpg picture of lion, when I do that, one.jpg goes into this variable called image source. So whenever I say image source, I'm talking about one.jpg. And image alt gets the second variable. And so what I've done is I've really cleaned up the code because everything's in here. So what that does is that takes and it sets the big images source attribute to image source, and it sets the alt attribute to image alt. And I have that line duplicated 3 times. So think of how much easier this would be if I wanted to add images. If I had 5 more, it's like my web page worked, but hey, I found 5 more other images that I took a different time from the zoo and I want to update the web page. All I'd have to do is copy this and just change 1, 2, 3, 4 things. I've also, for accessibility, given an access key to this. What that means is Alt1 sets it to that, Alt2 sets it to that, Alt3 sets it to that. Why would I have alt images? I would have alt image, or what we already talked about alt images. That's accessibility reasons for people that are accessing the page with a screen reader. Alt attribute, that is, not alt images. But why would we have this? Well, if someone has arthritis. Now these are big thumbnails, all right? So it wouldn't be too difficult to get your mouse over those. But if these were smaller thumbnails, they can simply, just by holding the Alt down and do that, that'd be much easier for someone with arthritis to do. I had a student in class years ago that had some neurological issue, and they were the same thing. They would never use the mouse, all right, because it was too difficult for them to control the mouse. So they did everything via the keyboard. And by putting these keyboard shortcuts in there, look how simple it is to do. It takes you how much more time to do that than to just put the image tag, you know, negligible amount of time. And you know what? People that don't have arthritis, all right, does it bother them the fact that there's these access keys on here? Of course not, you know. However, there's some people that always use the keyboard, all right? Even if they're not disabled, they just like to use a keyboard. And this gives them the ability to use a keyboard to navigate, because like I remember especially working with people who were actually very quick typists on the keyboard. They don't like to take their hand off the keyboard and use the mouse, all right, because that slows them down. But if you give them an access key, boom, they can go right to it right away. So these values get plugged into here, and then are used to change the source attribute and the alt attribute. All right, let's look at some other examples. I'm going to jump around in this folder. I'm going to look at forms. This is the old example we had before where we put in something to search for, and we do a Google search. What if we don't put everything in? What's Google going to do? Well, it's not going to like it. All right, so I put in an error message that says, change this red, change it to italics. When the page loads originally, that's regular font. As I click submit, change that, not just the color of it, you know, red is a good color for errors because most people would associate that with something wrong. All right. But for people that are colorblind that can't distinguish red, I made it in italics. So that ought to tip them off something is wrong. All right. In addition, I put right next to it must enter something. So even if they're colorblind, they see that special message in italics, must enter something. So I presented that error several ways. Some people put, you know, you could easily, and think about this if you want, you can easily put an X or a check next to it if it was correct or incorrect. All right. So how do I do this? How do I do this? If on submit, I'm going to call a function again called validate form. And what that function does is it uses the document object model to see if I've typed anything in that name box called Q. So that input as a name Q and an ID of Q. I find the thing that has an ID of Q. And if I see the value when I trim it is nothing. What do I mean by trimming it? It gets rid of leading and trailing spaces. All right. Why is that important? Well, if I typed in space, 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 that's also not legal, right? So I would want to catch that as an error. So I get rid of any leading and trailing spaces before I do the search or before I validate it. All right. And this returns either true or false. The return value of a function is sort of the answer that the function gives. This function is asking, is this valid? And I do this test and I return either it's valid or it's invalid. So what am I doing? If there's nothing in the text box, that's what the if statement says. If, and there's a condition, there's nothing in the text box, I do these things. I set the return value to false. I set the inner HTML to must enter something of QWhere, and I changed the class of QLabel to error. And I have in CSS a class of error to be used when there's a problem. I call this function and I return the return value to the onSubmit event. So if the onSubmit gets a true, it continues and it submits the form to Google. If not, it doesn't submit it. Now, if this doesn't make sense to you, if you haven't done any kind of programming languages before, I could see where this would be confusing. So keep in mind, you don't have to understand all of the examples that I'm giving here today. It's fine. As long as you understand one of them and can make one of them work for your assignment, that's okay. If you are interested in learning more about this, we have a class that talks about client and server scripting. It goes into more details on JavaScript. We have this other one. That does a calculation. This calculates the circumference of a circle, which is 2 pi times the radius. So if I type in 1, 2 pi times the radius should be 6.28 something. And there we go. How does this work? Well, this doesn't send a request to the server. This does a calculation all in JavaScript. So I have here instead of a submit button, I have just a regular old button that when I click on it, it calls calculate. Calculate gets the radius from the text box with an ID of radius. It tests to make sure that I put something in there that is a number, because if I put some nonsense in there, I can't calculate it. So I display must enter a number. Otherwise, it calculates the circumference. And I display what the circumference is by calculating the circumference in this statement and then putting it in the inner HTML. I know I'm going over these quick because I want to at least talk briefly about all of them, and then you can explore them on your own and see what it does. A great way to study programming in any case is to take code, example code, and tweak it to change it. Like, can you take this and change it to calculating the area of a square? Would be one example. Can you do that? Put a second text box on the screen and change it to calculate the area of a rectangle. All those things are like good practice. That helps you to see if you really understand it. Because it's one thing for me to look at this example and say, well, yeah, when he explained it, I kind of understood what's going on. It's another thing to take that and do something with it. And sort of the first step in doing something with it is maybe not writing a big piece of code of your own, all right? But to just take it and tweak it a little bit, to change it. So I would suggest doing that to study these functions to make sure you understand exactly how they work. Last several examples we have are sort of on the same theme as each other. I have one to change. If I click on an item, I drop down and create a submenu. Small text, big text. Interestingly enough, this is called color, yet this has nothing to do with color. I don't know. When I made this example, I must have copied it from something else. If you look, you can see that for each item on the menu, each menu item, I have a submenu list described right underneath it. And I made all the links be pound sign just to the top of the page because I don't have real pages here, but these, you know, in a real example, these would be other links, other pages. When I click on the menu item, then change that to display the menu. I actually toggle it. What do I mean by toggle? I mean turn it on and off. So if I load the page originally, they're all off. I click on it, it turns it on. I click on it again, it turns it off. So this function does that. If it's being displayed, I make it invisible. If it's invisible, I make it displayed. And again, you can see how the HTML and CSS and all this work together. Other examples in here, I think, are just variations of this. This uses a mouse over, and I guess never hides it. That would be a good exercise for you. Can you make it hide it when I take my mouse off? This example kind of the same as the other one. And this example is sort of the same, except it uses a mouse over instead of the click event. This could be very handy to add to your project. If you had a group of pages that were similar, you know, well, I know because the student already turned in their assignment, but a student used this very effectively because they did a website about Cedar Point. And they had a list of rides. So under ride, they had a list of the popular attractions at Cedar Point. So they had a menu option for rides. And when you put your mouse over that, it would display the list of rides and you could pick from it. All right. That's a nice, concise way to do that, because if you're not interested in rides, you take your mouse off of it and they disappear. So this is a good way to add a lot of content when you have relatively little real estate. And again, this is basically the format that one of our first examples uses here. That is just this with some bells and whistles added to it. Or the same thing you get on LorraineCCC.edu. Or even www.lorraineCCC.edu. To put your mouse over it. How would you change it to be horizontal? You actually, and this would be a great challenge for anyone. I know it's the end of the semester, you folks just want to be done with this. But if you want to take these things and run with it and really understand it, the links are oriented horizontally. In this example, the links are oriented vertically. Could you take this and make it stretch across the screen and have the submenus underneath it? That'd be a great thing to test, to see if you could do. And I would challenge you to do it without making any changes to the CSS or HTML. Well, you need to make a little tweak to the CSS, but primarily doing everything via JavaScript. You should, slap myself. You would be making all your changes via CSS. You should not have to change the JavaScript. You should not have to change the HTML. You would make some changes to the CSS to just display these horizontally across the page. And so on. All right, take the time to review these examples on your own. You don't have to be an expert at JavaScript to understand all of these, but find one that works for you incorporate it in for your lab 13, I guess it is, and try to incorporate it somewhere in your project. All right, if you think hard enough, probably can find a place where you can use some JavaScript. If you have trouble coming up with that, let me know and I can assist you. All right, are there any questions? All right, that's all for today. Remember, next week there is no lecture. So if you want to come to lab, you can come to lab in person to BU 102, or you can come to lab virtually in WebEx according to the syllabus. And that's a chance for you to get any question you have answered about any assignments that you haven't turned in yet, or get your project reviewed before you have to turn it in.